Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Bintou, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe as I upload new videos every Wednesday and some Saturdays. All right. So in today's video, I want to talk about how I annotate or take notes on books using my Kindle. Over the past couple months especially, I've been basically reading 100% on my Kindle. The only exception being texts that I have to read for my class. I have a physical book for that. But otherwise, all my reading has been 100% digital on my Kindle. Now, I personally own the latest generation Kindle Oasis. And so this is what that looks like. I was in the middle of reading there, but yeah. So it looks something like this. It's just your typical Kindle ebook reader. But when I first started taking notes on my Kindle, I didn't have a particularly good system. I tried a few different things. And so today I want to talk to you guys about what I have found to work for me. So the first thing I want to touch on is what I look for when I'm actually note-taking, highlighting, annotating, whatever you want to call it. Because I use a Kindle, most of my annotating is actually highlighting. But then what I do is, and I'll go over this later in the video, I'm going to export my highlights or export my notes, and then I'm going to annotate them further on my iPad. Okay, so the first thing I want to touch on is what do I look for when I am highlighting as I'm reading books? And it's different depending on whether I'm reading fiction or nonfiction. So I want to talk a little bit about what I look for when I'm reading fiction versus what I look for when I'm reading nonfiction books. So for fiction, most of my highlights tend to be if I come across an insightful quote from one of the characters in the book and I really like it and it spoke to me in some way, that's usually what I'm highlighting. This is especially true if I'm reading literary fiction. And I'll provide some examples of what I mean by that. So here is an example of a quote from Sofia Segovia's The Murmur of Bees, which I talked about before. I called it the most beautifully written book that I've read so far this year. So this book I actually had quite a number of highlights from, and here's one of them. Because it is at night that fear is most frightening, yes, but it is also when sorrow becomes deeper and one regrets what one did or did not do more. It is in the deepest darkness that one sees things most clearly. So when I was reading the book, I came across this quote and I thought that it was really beautifully written, and I interpreted it in my own way. And I think it did a really good job of juxtaposing the darkness of night, but being able to see more clearly in the night. I actually have another quote from that book. You leave a place or say goodbye to someone, and thereafter you feel the existence you have left behind is frozen by your absence. And I think that if any of us have moved away from people, you may feel this in some way. It spoke to me because I know that I've moved away from my immediate family, and every time I go back to visit them, it always shocks me how much everyone has changed. You know, they've grown or grown older. And it's so true. When you leave a place, you kind of feel like you've left it behind and it should freeze, except life keeps going on, right? And she's able to summarize these thoughts in a way that I never could. It's just so beautifully written. So that's an example of literary quotes that I like to highlight while I'm reading. And then sometimes I come across a really funny quote and I decide to highlight that. For example, I came across this quote when I was reading If It Bleeds by Stephen King, and it says, "You know what they say, Brian, death takes the best of us and death takes the rest of us." This probably is a quote that people know. I don't know. I'd never come across it before and I thought it was pretty funny, so I highlighted that. And here's another one. I was reading this contemporary romance. It's called Party of Two by Jasmine Guillory. And I came across this quote in there that I thought was pretty funny too. The three wise men, Jack, Jim, and Jose, the most disgusting thing I've ever put in my body. And I think she was referring to a drink that she had at some party in college. So that was pretty funny. And here's another quote from Verity, and it goes like this. Here, I'm invisible, unimportant. Manhattan is too crowded to give a shit about me, and I love her for it. And I highlighted this because I grew up in New York City, so I completely understand what she's talking about, how massive Manhattan is and how you can kind of just disappear in the crowds. So yeah, all of those quotes spoke to me in some way, shape, or form, or I thought they were funny, and that's the reason why I annotated those. I will say in general, fiction is my least annotated genre, especially the books that I read for fun. And I do generally read fiction books for fun, for pure enjoyment. And so yeah. Now, if for some reason I'm reading fiction for assignments, which I haven't had to do in a number of years, but if I am reading fiction for an assignment, usually things that I'm looking out for are clues, are things like character motivation. So passages that highlight why a character did a certain thing that they did, passages that highlight or talk about the character's state of mind, reasoning that the characters use to defend their action, and anything that generates a question for me that I can then go on and investigate further. I don't have any examples of that off the top of my head because, again, I haven't read fiction for an assignment in a while. All right. So now let's talk about nonfiction, which tends to be much more heavily highlighted and annotated because it's much more informational. And the first kind of nonfiction that I'll talk about are those informational texts. So those books that I read because I want to learn more about a specific topic. And usually when I'm reading nonfiction books like that, the things that I tend to highlight are conclusions that the author was able to come to from a set of data or interview or information. And also if there was any statistics or data that I found were really interesting, really fascinating that I would want to refer back to in the future. Occasionally, authors will reference other books, so I'll highlight that information and make a note of it so that it's something that if it is something that I want to check out in the future, I can do that. And also I'll highlight definitions. So especially if it's on a topic that I am unfamiliar with, usually authors do a pretty good job of defining these things, and so I will highlight that. An example of that actually is I recently read the book Not a Crime to Be Poor, and the author did a pretty good job of defining things in that book that I didn't know too much about. For example, money bail. So he defined money bail as the practice of making a defendant put up a large sum of money to ensure that he will appear for trial, regardless of whether he poses a danger to the community or himself. So that's an example of a definition that I might highlight while I'm reading. An example of a conclusion that the author has come to after presenting a bunch of information would be something like this particular highlight from Invisible Woman. But the global data gap when it comes to the sexual harassment and violence women face in the workplace is not just down to a failure to research the issue. It's also down to the vast majority of women not reporting. And this in turn is partly down to organizations not putting in place adequate procedures for dealing with the issue. Women don't report because they fear reprisals and because they fear nothing will be done, both of which are reasonable expectations in many industries. That book was also full of a ton of statistics that I am not going to include in this video because it would be far too much, but I have those all saved as part of my annotations for this book in particular. Within the genre of nonfiction, I have found myself reading a lot of memoirs and autobiographies this year. And with that category of nonfiction, what I'm highlighting is a little bit more different because they're not usually presenting data, they're talking about their lives. And I especially like to highlight the insights and conclusions that the author has come to reflecting on their life experiences, especially if one, their life experiences are very different from mine and in a way that I never could experience. And two, if they're able to articulate something in a way that I never could. And I've got two examples of that. So one of the books that I read this year that I really loved was Trevor Noah's autobiography / memoir, Born a Crime. And he mentions this in his book. Many Black families spend all of their time trying to fix the problems of the past. That is the curse of being Black and poor, and it is a curse that follows you from generation to generation. My mother calls it the Black tax. Because the generations who came before you have been pillaged, rather than being free to use your skills and education to move forward, you lose everything just trying to bring everyone behind you back up to zero. And this is something that I both witnessed and experienced, and I've never been able to put it into words as beautifully as Trevor does in that sentence. And having highlighted that and saved that, I actually was able to use it in a discussion that I had in one of my courses. And so that's one way that highlighting and annotating these books is useful. And then more recently, I read In the Dream House. And I picked this book up because Jalen from the Bard in a Bookcase talked about it in a number of his videos, so I figured it must be really good. And it was very highly rated, and I read the entire thing and it was fantastic. here is, and this is an example of a narrative or a story that I could never experience, because she is discussing her experience being abused in a same-sex relationship with her partner. And one of the passages that I highlighted while reading this book was, "Places are never just places in a piece of writing. If they are, the author has failed. Setting is not inert. It is activated by point of view. Later, you will learn that a common feature of domestic abuse is dislocation. That is to say, the victim has just moved somewhere new, or she's somewhere where she doesn't speak the language, or has been otherwise uprooted from her support network, her friends, or her family, her ability to communicate. She is made vulnerable by her circumstance, her isolation." And so while I was reading, I came across that and thought that that was a pretty important feature that I needed to highlight. Okay, so that was a pretty long-winded explanation of what I look for when I'm highlighting books, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and within nonfiction, the informational text versus the memoirs. Now I want to talk about how I actually highlight on my Kindle. All right, guys, so here we are looking at my Kindle, and I want to show you what I do when I have done all of my highlighting and I reach the end of the book. So I will use Invisible Woman as an example, and this book is written by Caroline Criado Perez. And I actually have a ton of highlights for this book because it was filled with a lot of information. So this is a nonfiction book. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up the book, and what I can do from here is I can go to, and then if I click on notes over here, I'm able to export my notes. And I do have to turn off airplane mode. But once it connects to the internet, it will export my notes to my Kindle email address, which is the email address that I use for my Amazon account. And it says it right there. So we will send your notes and highlights to the email address on your Amazon account. And I hit send, and the email with the notes is on its way to my email address. And so that's how I export all of my notes from my Kindle to my computer or to my phone or my tablet. It'll be attached as a PDF and as a text file on my computer. Okay, so once I have gotten the PDF document sent to my email, I can then annotate it in one of two ways. The first method that I use is my iPad and my Apple Pencil. Now, I do this because I happen to have an iPad and Apple Pencil. I didn't buy these for the express purpose of annotating PDFs for books that I read. I had to get one of these when we switched to distance learning because of the coronavirus, and because I have math classes, I needed a way of like writing and showing that on screen to my students. It just also happens to work really well for me to annotate my books. I like handwriting in like margins of things, so I can do that on my iPad with the Apple Pencil, and I'll show myself doing that. All right, so I've got my iPad here, and what I can do is very quickly airdrop the file, the PDF document on here. So once it's on here, I like to use the app. It's called PDF Expert. And this allows me to further annotate this document, and that could be either by marking it up with writing or by using the highlight feature, which means that I can highlight my highlights even further if I want to point out something even more. So I'm gonna scroll through this document. This is a little bit long because, like I said, this book was full of a lot of information and a lot of statistics. But here's an example of something that I want to bring more attention to, and it's this part right here. So we lack consistent sex disaggregated data from every country, but data that we do have makes it clear that women are invariably more likely than men to walk and take public transport. So that is an important conclusion that the authors came to, and on the margins I will jot down here. So women are more likely than men to take public transport. And so then that'll be there for me to look back on as something that was extra important. And I can scroll through and do this several times. And so this right here is a statement on paid versus unpaid work, which was a really important point that she made in this book as well. So that's something I want to highlight. And so I would go through this whole document and do that if I were planning to, for example, do a review on this. And eventually I'm going to send this document back to my computer and save it on there for future reference. And then the second way, if you, for example, don't have an iPad and Apple Pencil, is that I just simply annotate the PDF on my computer. So within whatever PDF program you use, there's usually options to kind of put little notes there, and instead of handwriting those notes, I just type them in and then they will be saved in the document. And then once all of that is done, I can just save the final document on my computer. I have a folder of notes that I've taken from books, and if I ever need to refer back to them, which has been especially useful since starting YouTube, because there are books that I've been talking about that I read many months ago, and honestly I can't remember what they were about. But going through the highlights that I made and the notes that I wrote about those books, I'm able to remind myself what was important about them and what I want to discuss with you guys. Okay, so the last thing that I want to touch on is actually a service that I have used a free trial of that I thought was really interesting. I didn't go on to pay for it because I didn't feel like I needed to, but I did like it. And if you are not aware of it, it might be something that you want to try out. So there's this website called Readwise where you can sign up, and it connects to your Amazon account, I believe, which means that it actually has access to all of the highlights that you've made on your Kindle books. And what happens is I think it's every single day, you're sent an email that has a random assortment of highlights that you've made from your books. And they actually include at the very bottom a book recommendation based on your highlights. And what I really liked about this is that it allowed me to revisit highlights from books that I had read long ago and had forgotten or hadn't revisited in a really long time. And the free trial lasted a pretty decent while, and I did enjoy it while I had it. So if you've never tried it, at the very least, you should definitely check out the free trial. All right, guys, so that's it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed hearing me talk about what I like to annotate in my books, fiction and nonfiction, and also how I do that on my Kindle. And lastly, the little spiel about readwise and how awesome I think that is. If you have a system that you use for annotating, whether it be in physical books or in your ebooks, then definitely let me know down in the comments below. I think I'm gonna do another video on how I annotate library books, because I do occasionally get physical books from my library, and I like to take notes while I'm reading on those, but obviously I can't write in the book, so I have come up with a way around that. So yeah, I'll probably work on that video in the future. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.